The truth is, I'm not a doctor or a lawyer. I'm nothing really. I'm just a kid who talks about Catch Me If You Can. Let's talk about it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back, the Eye of the Storm podcast. Daniel, can you please let the people know what we're going to be discussing or debating today?
So, this is Have You Seen, in which we talk about a movie that some of us know well and others have just seen for the first time. This week, we are talking about Catch Me If You Can from 2002. Catch Me If You Can is a comedy drama that follows the life of Frank Abagnale, who in 1969 runs away from home at age 17 and begins scamming his way through life, pretending to be an airline pilot, forging bank checks, pretending to be a doctor, pretending to be a lawyer, and so on, until he draws the attention of the FBI. And then a cat and mouse game ensues between the FBI agent who's trying to catch him and Frank trying to evade capture. And the story then unfolds from there. So, however, you picked this one. Why did you pick it, and what's interesting about it?
I picked this one because this is kind of one that I watched, several times over the years, and it's kind of one that I've always had, really good fond memories of. For me, it's always been exciting and kind of a bit of a thrilling ride, just kind of following this con artist, Frank Abagnale, as he's like doing some of the most like audacious and outlandish things like becoming a pilot or becoming a lawyer or becoming a doctor, just kind of at a whim, just through his kind of sheer self-confidence and sort of sheer ability to kind of like blag his way through certain situations. Obviously you kind of add on the element of the counterfeiting of sort of checks as well to that as well. It just kind of always seemed quite thrilling, and obviously like Leo kind of gives a great performance in this, and there was always that element of like heart as well to this movie, and kind of like something that kind of like just like was a little bit warming about the movie, because ultimately it's kind of like a boy that kind of just wanted his family and just kind of wanted his mum and dad to work out, and he kind of at like this kind of inciting incident where they have a divorce is like acts out because of it. And all he ever wants, and all he kind of wants is for his dad to be able to kind of win his mum back and stuff like that. So there was like a bit of a warming element to it as well as like the thrilling, exciting aspect of it. To be honest, kind of watching it recently, whilst being a little bit older and a little bit more critical of movies, that thrilling aspect of it, of the con and like the cat and mouse games and the chase and stuff like that, probably isn't as amazing as I kind of like imagined it when I was like younger, but it's still a very, very, very good movie, an easy one to kind of put on when you've got, family or friends around, to be honest. So that's kind of why I picked it, why I suggested it. But I'll kind of hand over to you guys to give your thoughts, because I know Dan, you've probably seen it before, and Jonathan, I imagine it's your first time seeing it.
Yeah, it was my first time seeing it. It was a good film. All I could think about was Wolf of Wall Street, and I was like, okay, it makes sense why he was so good in Wolf of Wall Street, because this film, of course, is committing fraud, same ballpark. You know what I'm saying? I just think his ability to commit fraud and detect fraud was borderline fascinating. I'm not trying to exaggerate or just say milk it or deride, but of course it was his performance, which is definitely the highlight, and obviously the chemistry between him and Tom Hanks kind of gave off like Tom Hanks in a way was like a good father figure in contrast to his actual father, which I'm going to ask questions when it comes to his actual father, because I think that was a bit of a question mark for me, but that'll come off later. But yeah, I think definitely performance in this was definitely the highlight for me, but the performance in committing fraud and the way that he did it, and just being the con artist that he was, the way that he performed in that role, I was like, yeah, it definitely got me engaged in the film. Because at first when it started, I was like, I don't know, I wasn't really getting into it, but slowly, the more that I was watching, I was getting into it. So I said, yeah, it's a really good film. So I'm glad I watched this one. I'm kind of surprised I haven't even heard of this film. So how is this film kind of like regarded when it comes to the greatest movies of all time? Is it like talked about in that same category, or is it just a good film for its time?
I don't know how it's kind of regarded historically, because I kind of don't sort of know, or I haven't sort of gone and checked people's opinions of it. I actually don't even know what the Rotten Tomatoes is of this, but it's certainly not in sort of some of those conversations. And I don't think when people talk about Leonardo DiCaprio movies, I don't really ever hear this one kind of mentioned as much as like some of his other movies or some of his other performances. To be honest, historically, so on that front, unsure. But again, for me, it's just one of those ones where it just kind of hits the right spot, and I wouldn't put it personally as one of the greatest movies of all time. I wouldn't say that, but it's a very good and it's a very easy watch. is a category that I'd put it in.
So just to put some perspective into this, the Tomato people have it at 96% for reviews and 89% for audiences. And it's widely regarded as not Spielberg's best movie by any stretch, but just a really good one and a really solid one. It's a relatively small movie that I think was more of a passion project as opposed to a commercial one, but it did end up making quite a bit of money. It's just widely regarded as just Spielberg, Hanks, and DiCaprio just doing their thing at a high level. I think that's the general consensus.
And then you're kind of, you've seen this again, having seen it maybe like 10 or so years ago. What was your kind of take watching it with fresher eyes?
Yeah, so I've seen this a few times, not too often. The last time was probably a good 10 years ago. This is also the first time I watched it with like a critical eye. And I found it interesting how little it kind of holds up, because I always remembered this movie as essentially a heist movie, right? Where the centerpiece is Frank's scams and how he kind of eludes the FBI and justice and just scams society into giving him what he wants, essentially. And I was surprised at how unimpressive the scams are. There's like one or two different places where the scams are actually interesting and they actually work. And the bulk of them, I think, shouldn't work, basically, because people call him out on his nonsense all the time and never seems to have ramifications. We can go into the details of that, but I think with one or two exceptions, the scams, I don't think, are really the attraction. Like there's other movies out there that do that kind of thing better, or even just studying real con artists and real scams is much more interesting than this, I think. I still had a really good time watching this, and I think that is because a movie can be carried really far by likable performances or strong performances and good pacing, good production values, a tight script, and this movie has all of them. The movie really makes us care about Frank and about Carl. The interplay between those two characters and how they essentially, in a way, become lifelong friends because they are in each other's lives for so long. I think that works really well. And it's also really fun to watch Frank just do his thing, even if it doesn't make that much sense, but just the way he kind of slithers his way through society and slips through the cracks and that sort of thing. That is at least fun to watch, and it's entertaining, and it's a bit of a spectacle. I think there's enough set pieces in here where Frank does impressive stuff, like at the airport when the FBI is looking for him, and so he instigates this stewardess scouting program to flood the airport with the stewardesses who are very enthusiastic and happy to be there and draw a lot of attention, and so he kind of just slips past the FBI. That's a cool sequence. I don't know how real that is or how much sense it makes, but it's a fun set piece, and the movie has a few of those. And I think I really enjoyed it on that level.
I think we can maybe like kind of start off on maybe the realism of it, potentially, because I think you kind of touched on the kind of like the scams and the cons not really singing or not sort of living up to sort of how you remember them. And I think I had like a similar experience with it, where it's almost like where we were younger, we were almost like kind of swept up by his charm and like the audaciousness of it. Because even watching it with my younger nephews, it's like every time he then introduced a new scam, or you can kind of see like he's got the idea to do something else, like become a doctor or become a lawyer, and like kind of scam his way into that. It was just like the audaciousness of it that kind of got them going when they were watching it. A lot of the movie is kind of heavily fictionalized. Obviously, Frank Abagnale is based on a true person, and there's like question marks over how far some of these cons actually went, etc. But they do apply a lot of movie magic to it. So do you think that they had like the right approach to it, and what could they have done to maybe make it hold up a little bit better in the long run, do you think?
As far as the historical accuracy goes, I think it takes some liberties with the official account of what Frank Abagnale did. And then the official account has been questioned since the movie has been made, where in true fashion, Abagnale kind of has been bullshitting people in order to sell his story, which is getting a little bit meta. So Abagnale was a con artist who then embellished his life story to get more money out of the film studios, and they then embellished the story to make a better movie. So we're like several layers deep into the bullshit, right? Which I think, like, honestly, in any other movie I would complain about this. For this movie, it's kind of on brand. But I think it is interesting to kind of question just how much of this he actually did. I'm kind of approaching it as just a story, right? Like if I want to know about this guy's life, then I'm sure there are biographies or other accounts out there that are more factual. I'm basically just viewing this as a fictional story where you shouldn't get too invested in the details. And the question is it entertaining, which might is not what I would typically say, but I think because we're talking about a con artist, like a certain amount of embellishment and loose relationship with the truth is kind of baked into it. That's just part of it. One thing that's kind of notable is how the entire thing about the father is made up. Apparently, Abagnale, after running away from home, never talked to his father again. Impressing his father or caring, like providing for his father or getting the approval of his father was never his motivating factor. And all of that takes up a large part of the movie. And it's just not what happened. And I don't know that it actually makes the movie stronger. I think this is just like Hollywood nonsense, where they have to tie it back to family and they have to tie it back to that kind of personal level. It can't just be a con artist who was 3 steps ahead of everybody for decades and then justice caught up with him. Like that can't be the story. It has to be about family and more personal and so on. And I don't know that really works or that actually makes the story better. As for the scams themselves, I think the ones that there were a few in there that really worked. So one of them is what he learns from his father about like this whole thing about the locket, where he flatters like women working in shops or in banks by telling them how beautiful they are and whether or not they drop this expensive locket, and then they're incentivized to say yes, even when everybody knows that they didn't, and so on, right? So that seems to me like a scam that really works. The other one is when he hooks up with this actress and he's supposed to pay her for a night with her, and he basically scams her into her paying him. That is how scams work, right? Like the way he fast talks and about this entire shell game, about the checks, and about he basically gets her to say what he wants her to say, but to her it feels like it was her idea and all of that. Like that feels very authentic to how scams work. And there's also other stuff like he figures out what he needs to say to pilots so that he doesn't have to fly the plane, right? So he always says he's specialized in another brand of plane or in another model. And that basically stops any conversation with the real pilot. Like when he's hitching a ride on a plane, right? He knows exactly what to say to a pilot to get them to accept him without actually him having to do anything. But that is then contradicted when he becomes a practicing lawyer just by watching like 2 legal dramas, and then suddenly he thinks he can BS his way through a court case, and then we see him completely fall on his face because he doesn't know what he's talking about, and a judge calls him out for it, and then nothing happens, right? Like there's a scene where he gives this big impassioned speech that he copied from a movie, and then the judge outright calls him out for it, and the mistake is something really dumb, like he's appealing to a jury that's not in the room because it's like a pre-trial hearing or something like that. And why is he not being kicked out? Why is he not being fined? Why is not being charged with with fraud? It's like at that point, right? Same thing in the hospital, where by watching a few episodes of hospital drama, he can convince other doctors that he is a doctor. And it seems to me like the way you do this is you don't scam. Like if you're pretending to be a doctor, you don't scam doctors and nurses because they know what they're talking about and they will catch you in the lie. You try to scam patients or people who are not doctors, so that you play on the expectations of what a doctor is like and what they look like and how they behave and how they talk. It seems to me like that's what a con artist would do, as opposed to just pretend. Like, I don't know that you can scam dozens of doctors and nurses in that way by pretending to be a doctor, right? Because your lies should tie directly into their expertise. And, like there have been con artists like this, but usually they do it in very specific ways that kind of avoid doing exactly that, right? Like there's some famous scams in science, and the way they usually work is by finding reasons for why they can't behave like normal scientists, and they just come up with data that is really, like, that's a breakthrough, but they sidestep all the ways in which this is supposed to be done, and they have a good reason. They always have a reason for it, and then other people just accept it because they're getting results. There's usually like a method to getting around having to do the job in a way, right? And he kind of does this a little bit in the hospital, but not really. So I just think there's like entire sequences in here where the scam doesn't work and shouldn't work, but it doesn't blow up in his face when it should. And I think that really drags down the story, but that's contrasted with parts where it does work, because there are certain ways to which scams work, right? By letting people make assumptions, and by putting words in people's mouths, or by doing like a cold reading where you say something general that people then remember as being specific, right? Like, there are ways of doing this, right? And any con artist would know these techniques. And it seems to me like whenever he was doing stuff like that, it really worked. Whenever he was just pretending to be something he was not, didn't quite work as much.
Mm-hmm. I think this kind of speaks to that a little bit, and I'll kind of hand over to Jonathan as well, because I know you want to kind of speak on the cons and stuff. But I think the difference between the pilot and kind of what he did as a lawyer and as a doctor was that as a pilot he had the opportunity to actually interview the pilot, and he was like asking loads of questions and had like that one-to-one kind of direct contact with the pilot, whereas in the other scenarios he was kind of just like trying to learn off of what was on TV, and it was like a little bit more generalized. And that kind of speaks to his character, is that he knows what he knows, but he doesn't know what he doesn't know. So he doesn't know how to, con his way through being a doctor or being a lawyer, which is, why I don't think he was like, in those roles for as long, and he was quite able to kind of just like slip back into being a pilot a lot easier than any of those other roles, to be fair. But I do agree with you in the sense that when you're kind of watching it, it's like obvious that he doesn't know what he's doing, and it's obvious he isn't a real doctor and he isn't a real lawyer, and it does bring it down a little bit. And I think there could have been a little bit more of a creative way to try and get around that. So I do agree with that.
So I would say the reason why I didn't really have too much of an issue with it was because I thought it was more of a reflection of what society was like at the time. Because I do know, I forgot who mentioned this. I don't even know if it was Daniel that mentioned this, but someone did mention this to me, where like it was easy to pretty much like commit fraud when it comes to like traveling, for example, around America. You could get from one place in America to Miami, for example. And I see this in many movies as well, where, people from Colombia are going to Miami easily on like fake passports and stuff like that. So the reason why, when I saw like, some of the con things that he was doing, I said to myself, and obviously, and it was very gullible, like as in like people were very gullible and they were believing. Firstly, the words that he was using were very ambiguous, and they were like pretty much universal in the sense where it made sense where you could get away with certain things. Like, for example, with the scene when he was a doctor, and then obviously he was they called him to go and do surgery, and he ended up passing it on, for me, cleverly passing it on to the other doctor. And I was like, okay, the language that he was using, I said, okay, that even though he wouldn't be able to get away with it now, but at the same time, I said to myself, he was still using language where you can still get away with it, as mixed with how gullible people were back in the day. I thought it was believable for its time. So I would say, like I said, I don't know, but like I said, like a lot of things were happening back in the day where committing crime, just like especially when it comes to fraud and conning people, was way easier back in the day in comparison to now.
And there's like that level of like confidence as well, which kind of sways people. Even if you're kind of like saying something wrong, it's the fact that you're saying something confidently, which can like sway people. I know in the judge situation, the judge kind of looked at him like, what the hell? But when he was like acting like a doctor, it was like that assertiveness that he had and that confidence to sort of know, and that sort of level of audaciousness. Even in a situation where you can see that he pretends to be the fake supply teacher for a period of time, and actually he was like the supply teacher for about a week, which is pretty hilarious. But it was just like that aura of sort of kind of walking in, especially like among students, and just like commanding the room and sort of commanding sort of people's respect through your confidence, can sometimes kind of sway people, or can make people kind of look past certain things, or like not question the authenticity of certain things as well.
Like, all of this stuff is on a spectrum, right? Like, he's really good at forging documents and checks. That's kind of how he gets his start. That is how he gets a lot of the credentials that are just harder. Like Jonathan, like you said, in the 60s and 70s, the technology wasn't there where stuff like this would get caught very quickly or easily. And so this whole thing about messing up the branch number so that the check is in the mail for a week before anybody even looks at it, and by that time he's already left town, right? So I think that is something I thought that worked. The pilot stuff, by interviewing the pilot, he knew exactly what to say so that he wouldn't draw any attention. With the doctor, he was like a night shift administrator, so he never actually treated patients. And then there was this one emergency where he was called in and narrowly got away, right? And narrowly pawned it off on somebody, like one of the other doctors. And then as a lawyer, it makes no sense at all, where he's just outright practicing. And in fairness, he did really pass the bar exam, right? He says later on he didn't cheat on that. He really passed it. But why are you actually prosecuting cases in court? Like, that's like, if you want to get, like, that's where you should have gotten caught and didn't. And so I think that was kind of the weakest part. But so it's like, so I think it's a really mixed bag. And I think they should have leaned more into, like, to make the scams more believable, they should have leaned more into this whole bamboozling people who don't know better. Right? Like, if you're trying to be a lawyer, don't talk to other lawyers. Talk to somebody who doesn't know how lawyers really behave, or who couldn't spot a fake lawyer, that sort of thing. Because whenever he does that, it really works really well.
What did we think about the cat and mouse game between Frank and Carl Henry? I think that's kind of where you get, for me anyways, quite a bit of the heart in the movie. And I know you didn't quite like, or you kind of question the aspect of sort of Frank and his actual real father in this, and to know what the purpose of it, especially with most of it being embellished. Even though for me, I quite like that, because it gave his character a level of motivation. It gave his character a bit of a reason why he was doing what he was doing, because he wanted his father to kind of find his feet again, kind of level himself back up so he can get back with his mother and bring his family back. But in terms of like the cat and mouse game between some of Frank and Carl, how did that kind of play out? How did that seem for you? Did it work? If so, why? If not, why not?
So the thing about Frank and Carl, I think that really holds the movie together, because you have these two excellent actors who are really charismatic, and their performances hold the entire thing together. It's a very well-established dynamic, right, between the criminal and the FBI agent chasing them, right? Like, we've seen that in shows and movies over and over again. And I think they really make this work a little bit, where Frank keeps leaving clues, or contacting Carl on purpose because he doesn't have anybody else to talk to, and Carl is always there because he lost his family, and so this is kind of his big mission, right? And that drags on for years and years until they finally end up working together, and they kind of sort of trust each other, but not really, and they know each other well enough to not trust each other, or at least Carl doesn't trust Frank. Like, that's the human heart that holds this entire thing together. And I think the father angle honestly is redundant because of that, because I already care enough based on Frank and Carl as people. I don't need to kind of inject this thing about family. I don't know. Like, at least I didn't need it.
Yeah, it definitely did work for me. And it's crazy because it felt like Leonardo was not. It's crazy. It just did feel like Leonardo was trying to seek some sort of companionship from Carl, but from like a father figure type of perspective. Because obviously his father, like, this is going to lead to my question I had about the father. Because obviously, with the whole a good role model when it comes to being a father, and a whole bad role model when it comes to being a father. Of course, his actual father wasn't given what Leonardo DiCaprio. Oh, sorry, what Leonardo's character needed. So it felt like whenever he wasn't given what he needed, he ended up reaching out to obviously Cole, which was a bit weird because obviously you're calling the person in a way, giving him hints, but you're calling the person that's trying to get you arrested. But it was mixed with excitement of the whole cat and mouse thing. But at the same time, for me, I thought it because obviously he was seeking a place where he was empty when it comes to that a good role model and just a father figure and a companionship and acceptance and a bunch of other stuff. But I think I was zoning out when it came to, I don't know why I was, but I think I zoned out a bit whenever the father was on screen, because I forgot what his role was in Leonardo's life. So was it a thing where he didn't teach him the scams, did he?
He taught him a lot of basic scams in the beginning, like this whole thing about pretending that there's a funeral, and that's why Frank needs a suit, and getting kind of the shop assistant to open up the shop ahead of time, and just borrowing the suit, and then never, like, saying you just need to borrow the suit, and then you never return it, and that sort of thing. And also the thing about the locket, and about how to charm your way into getting what you want. All of that came originally from the father.
Okay, so then, because I remember, I think they were in the pub, and then Leonardo asked the dad to tell him to stop. In a weird way, Tom Hanks was kind of like the father he needed in his life, which made kind of like their relationship have a bit more emotional connection to their character, rather than just see like a whole cat and mouse, I can catch you, if I can catch you type of relationship. I enjoyed their character. I enjoyed what I was seeing, the interaction between Carl and Frank.
I think where the difference was between sort of Frank Abagnale Senior versus Carl Henry was that obviously like Frank, he'd come from living a good life. He'd come from like, all this money and like, a bit of the glitz and the glamour and stuff like that, and lost it. And it was almost like a bit of like a pride, and it was like the idea of what that kind of bring and what having all of that money would mean to them, and which is why like Frank Abagnale Jr. was so obsessed with trying to have enough money so that he can then have his mum back, because his mum, kind of came with the status and came with the money and came with that life. And you can kind of see she kind of almost did move on to someone else with money, and was like, living a good life in like in a nice house and starting a new family, which I kind of question, because they were two very old people to be having a 3 or 4 year old child, unless it was adopted, which it's not clear. It's not clear in the movie. Whereas, Carl was a little bit more of the reality, was a little bit more of grounding him a little bit in the end, in terms of trying to get him to kind of see sense and like see reality, and just see that all of it was like kind of for nothing. Like he's doing all this stuff, but really and truly he's just like a young boy who's like lonely, and he's just like craving that kind of companionship, really and truthfully. And he kind of reads him well on that front. So ultimately it was never about the money. It was about kind of building that relationship, and he just kind of didn't quite realize that, or didn't quite see that with his father, until it was too late, until his like father died, and obviously like with his mother as well. And then even with his mother, it was almost like he was like too far gone to even like make that connection with her in the very end.
Where the overall goal is to get his family back, right? To make everything the way it was when he was 17, right? And the idea is if he can just make enough money, he can kind of restore his family and get his parents back together. And then over time, he realizes that this is not happening, that the father is kind of too proud to take his money. The mom has moved on because she has a new family. And then in the end, he realizes, like, as he escapes from the plane and makes it to his mom's new house, and he sees that she has a new family and that she's not even paying attention to him, and that there's just no way forward. That's when he surrenders, right? Because he realizes, like, this entire thing has not worked, and he has to admit that he has failed in what he wanted to set out. But he's like got this very childish or childlike obsession with making things the way they were. And the money is, number one, a means to an end. And it also comes really easily. Like, I never got the impression that he just wanted to be rich. Like, the money was kind of a side effect of what he was doing. It's just that happened to be the thing that he was really good at, and that came with a lot of money. But that wasn't really the goal. The goal was make enough money to fix his father's mistakes, essentially, which was never going to work because the father's too proud and the mother's moved on and so on.
Pronounce Daniel, because I know you're like quite good at like analyzing and like picking out themes and like whataboutism is in the movie. Is there anything kind of new that you took from the story? Obviously, we kind of touched on like the themes of like family and the relationship with like the father and stuff like that. But were there kind of any other kind of like through lines you picked out in the movie?
So family is obviously the big one, right? Like this, like that, the relationship between Frank and Carl, and Frank's obsession with fixing his family, right? Like that is kind of the really overarching one. Another one I found was Frank kind of having this arrested development where he never really grows up until he gets caught in France by Carl, right? Like up until this point, everything is a game and everything comes easy to him, and he never really has to work for anything really. And the first time he gets arrested, that is really where things become real. One of the pivotal moments in this is when they're on the plane and Carl is bringing him back to the US, and he has got this dessert, and Frank tries to get the dessert out of Carl, and Carl just demonstratively eats it in front of him, telling me there's nothing you can say to get this from me when your entire life has been getting things from people for free. I thought that's kind of the point where it really became clear to Frank that part of his life is over, and from now on he has to be an adult when he never had to in the past. I just think in general I like pastry-based metaphors, and I think this is a good one.
Fair, yeah, no, that definitely, yeah, you can kind of definitely see that in there. I don't know. We kind of touched on like most of the things I kind of want to touch on. I don't know if there's any other like parts we want to raise.
Any ideas on the idea of a scam artist being a hero? Or like he's not really a hero, but he's the protagonist. He's the person we root for. This is a little bit different from most movies like this, where on the one hand, this is not a heist movie, right? Frank is a criminal in that he breaks all sorts of laws, but he doesn't really victimize very many people, not directly, not in a way we see. And also, the subject of the movie is not a heist, right? At the same time, scammers are usually villains, right? And like, this is not the only movie that makes the con artist entertaining, but just any thoughts on that, about how that fits into the movie, about how, like, what effect that has, or if that has any impact on the enjoyment anybody gets out of the movie.
Just his kind of like his swagger and his audaciousness kind of naturally makes you root for him. I think as well, like the key element here is, for the most part, it almost seems like a bit of a victimless crime, especially like as general population, you kind of see sort of all these money that these banks have. There isn't like a set victim on the bank side that you would maybe have sympathy for, that he's kind of committing these crimes against. And, you know, he doesn't fly and almost crash a plane with people on it, or he doesn't even attempt to fly a plane with all those lives on there. He doesn't prosecute anyone and send anyone to jail unfairly or unruly because of like his scams. And again, you know, as a doctor, that he doesn't really have any patience, apart from like that kind of one boy that comes in with the injury, but he quickly like passes responsibility to an actual doctor who's actually competent at dealing with it, as opposed to kind of trying to do something and mess it up. So for the most part, his cons are pretty victimless in a sense. And then you kind of match that with some of like the keyword I keep saying is like that audaciousness to kind of do something that's like daring, or do something that the regular person just wouldn't ever, you know, think to do, such as like, you know, impersonate a teacher. Like, and I feel like they like really do a good job, like kind of like building towards it as well. In terms of the first thing he does is like, you know, impersonate a teacher and like kind of almost like wins you over. It kind of like sways you, and you kind of like, you find it funny, you kind of like chuckle at it, and you're like, oh, can you imagine if you like were in school and you like pretended to be someone's teacher for a week? I feel like the movie does a good job of like winning you over to his side quite early on, because he's almost like the rebellious kid, because there isn't anyone to like really sympathize with on the other side. It just makes it like fun and thrilling for the most part to kind of be on this journey with him. And it's like, oh, like what's he gonna do next? And like, you know, the minute he gets like an idea to do something else that's a little bit crazy, you just kind of are with him. You're like, oh yeah, like what would that be like essentially?
I think in general, scammers are just fun to watch because they kind of are above society, right? Like, they kind of use the rules of society against itself. When it's done well, is really entertaining, and this kind of does that. Although I wish they had used real scams more, like in ways that are believable in terms of actually working, as opposed to the script kind of saying that it does, right? So, but I think it's a combination of a few things. I think what you said there about all of this being victimless, I think it's really important. They really go out of their way to make sure that nobody gets hurt by him, right? Like, or like if like he steals from banks and he just gets a free ride on an airplane, but he doesn't take anything away from anybody. Nobody has their life ruined because of what he did. And I think that's really a huge part of it. The fact that Leonardo DiCaprio is just really charismatic, and kind of you just want to like Frank as a result of that. But I think the thing that's a little bit ambivalent, maybe, just in terms of how sympathetic Frank is and him as a protagonist, is that he never has any regrets. Not really, right? Like, he eventually comes to accept that his efforts to rebuild his family is not going to happen, but he never shows he seems to be very regretful. He doesn't seem to have very many regrets about all the crimes he's committed. He kind of just makes himself useful to the FBI, and that's kind of how he continues. But he's just sorry he got caught, essentially. But I don't know that we see him have any scruples or regrets or doubts about what he's doing at any point, even after he is caught and even after he's in FBI custody. And I don't know, like, it certainly doesn't make him a hero, and by itself that's not very likable. But it seems to be a little bit, I don't know, like, I'm not complaining about it. I'm not saying the movie's wrong to do this. I'm just more observing it, that there's nothing redeeming really about Frank other than being charming.
I know you don't care about like the relationship with his father, but I feel like that does help to kind of put some of his actions into context, and it helps kind of humanize sort of what he's doing as well, by giving him a sympathetic motive of trying to reunite your family, essentially, which kind of softens what he's doing as well.
Yeah, I think that's why they added that in. I think if it was just about a con artist, then it would be a lot harder to sympathize with him. But because we see in him the 17-year-old kid who just wants his parents to get back together. Like that's so charismatic, like that's so relatable and so sympathetic that you can't not like him in a way. And then that makes it much easier to go along on the ride for whatever else he does in the movie.
I think his age plays a part in it as well, because there's a difference between like a 17-year-old doing this versus like someone that's 30 years old, and you're kind of looking at them like you should probably have your life together. Why are you doing this type of thing, as opposed to like a kid who's just kind of being free spirited and just challenging and being above society as a whole.
Yeah, there's something pathetic about an old hustler, right? There's a whole bunch of shows and movies where there's like an uncle or a father who is still hustling at 50 or 60. And it's just a little bit sad. Like you said, kind of at some point, should they have gotten legit? And even though Frank never does, I think, yeah, you're right. Like his age is a factor for why it makes it more innocent. And it kind of makes him an underdog too, right? Because he's always scamming people who are richer than him, who are more powerful than him, who are older than him. And that, I think, is a huge contributing factor as well.
For sure. So again, I know we kind of like briefly touched on it at the very, very beginning, but in terms of how this is held up, because this is from 2002, this is from a different era of movie making. How well does it hold up in 24 years later? I think it's correct. Yeah. How well does this kind of hold up 24 years later? Is this something that you would rewatch again?
I think it holds up really well. It's just a really well-made movie, and I think that is we've been kind of nitpicking like details of this for a while, but just as a movie, like this is just Spielberg just doing his thing really well. The guy really knows pacing and flow and how to just make characters relatable, and you kind of what their motivations are and what the stakes are, and from scene to scene it flows really well. And I think that is something that a lot of movies have kind of lost, where things kind of plod along and they kind of happen, but the flow of it is not as great in many cases. And kind of Spielberg, like he's not the only one who can do this, but he does it, I think, really well, where once you get into the flow of it and you kind of are along for the ride with the movie, it just feels right and it feels good and it feels like a proper movie. And I think that is kind of a big part of why this is so successful and so well liked. And that is, I think, why it is aged so well, is because it doesn't hinge on, like, there's obviously strong performances from the main cast in this, but I'm not sure how to call it. I was going to say like a comfortable watch, and I think it definitely is that, right? There's nothing all that challenging or difficult about this movie at all. You're kind of just along for the ride, and you watch Frank do his thing for 2 hours. And even though the movie is over 2 hours long, like I think it's 2 hours 20, it just feels the right amount. Like it doesn't drag, it doesn't repeat itself too much. Just the basic fundamentals of how the movie is constructed and told has a lot to do with how enjoyable it is to watch. And then you find this unusual setting where Frank runs circles around everybody and kind of does this thing, and it's kind of fun and kind of impressive to watch. But just the fundamentals of this are what hold the movie really together. And that is why it has the rewatchability it does. Like even if you know what happens to Frank, even if you know how the scams turn out, if you've seen all his bits before, it's still, let me rephrase that, even if you've seen all the set pieces, right? Like there's a few things in here that I think are quite fun, like when you watch them for the first time, right? This whole thing about kind of the fake stewardess recruitment program. That's one of the set pieces that really work, or kind of the showdown in the French village. There's some really strong scenes here, and even if you've seen them, even if you know what happens, you're just along for the ride, and it just feels right.
John, how does it hold up, and does it kind of go on the shelf?
I'm not sure. It holds up. 'Cause I definitely do feel like it has universal appeal. Daniel's right, it's definitely like a comfortable watch, and there's just much more going on than just a con artist trying to make a quick buck. You know what I'm saying? There's way more to it, and I do feel like him not feeling guilty in a way is justifiable. I think he feels like it was justifiable because he didn't go about it in a crude or malicious way. Like sometimes he would do it. For example, when he was conning his way into becoming a doctor, that was triggered from obviously seeing the girl crying who he ended up nearly marrying. And when he was pretending to be a teacher, what he was doing in their room was one of the kids that pushed into him, like a bully pushed into him. And then obviously I feel like that kind of gave him more of a justification, be like, yeah, I'm definitely, of more of a justification for him doing what he's doing. So I think, it definitely made it more interesting. It added a bit more depth into, not a bit more, but more depth into the story of a typical us watching a con artist reach to the top and end up falling. You know what I'm saying? There was way more to that. So like I said, and obviously with the relationship with him and Tom Hanks, it was like a father-son figure in a way. In terms of my personal, if it would go on my personal shelf, I'm not sure. I'm still 50-50 on that. However, in terms of rewatchability, I would watch it again. But I'm just thinking, would I watch it? Like, would I have it on my shelf? But I would watch it again, though, and I do think many people would watch it again. There's a lot that you can enjoy from this one.
There's another aspect that kind of just occurred to me, which is if I like as you were talking, I was kind of looking at the cast list, and obviously Tom Hanks, Leonardo DiCaprio, Christopher Walken, Martin Sheen, and Steven Spielberg. Like these are all big Hollywood names, right? I think DiCaprio was like 27 when this was made, so he'd been in the industry for a while, but not exactly a veteran yet at that point. But Tom Hanks was, and Walken was, and Spielberg was. The entire cast and kind of everybody involved with this, the entire cast is kind of just oozing with talent, including people who were just starting out when this movie was made, who then later turned out to be really big stars. And it seems to me a bit like a perfect storm where like this was made at a time by the right people who kind of pulled all this talent together. Like it's a little bit like have you ever seen one of those shows, like especially comedy shows, where it's like the first role of like 8 different people who would go on to be massive stars, and you can just see their talent on screen, even though they wouldn't be big stars for another 10 years. And it's a little bit like this, right? Like in a varying specs, there's some very experienced actors in this, and there's some very young actors in this who were young at the time, but who then later became on to do bigger things. I don't know. Like I think that's part of it too, that this was kind of made at a time when there was just a lot of talent in Hollywood, both upcoming and established. And it's kind of easy and cheap to say Hollywood doesn't have that anymore. But I actually think Hollywood doesn't have that anymore, not at the moment, where it's kind of hard to kind of see, like if you take even a good movie that comes out today, it seems to me like there's less of that, where there's just like there's no real weak performance in this. Even the small parts are played by really strong actors. It feels like on a different level than most movies, I think. That's part of it too.
Chris Nolan will challenge you on that with the Odyssey and the cast he kind of assembled for there. And to be fair, he actually kind of normally does pull quite good names actually for his movies. If you kind of think of like Oppenheimer and like, you know, some of the characters that were in there, like big and small as well, to be fair. But I get it, because like, I don't know whether like this was like one of the biggest movies of the year at that time. It kind of just feels like it was like one of like, you know, maybe like many good movies in that.
It wasn't. This was a small one.
Oh,
it was a really small movie. Like I think this had like a $50 million budget for a Spielberg production, 2002. This is pretty small. Based on some very light reading I've done, this seems to have been a passion project for Spielberg, where he really wanted to make this movie and tell the story, and kind of passed up a bunch of money to be able to do it. And you're right, like the thing with the Odyssey is if you just cast everybody, there's gonna be some talented actors in that, right? And Nolan, I think, is definitely one where really good actors just want to work with him. He just attracts people like that. At the same time, that's, I think, a rare exception. And I don't want to just say like there's no talent in Hollywood anymore. Clearly there is, but it still seems to be like a product of a different era, where there were just a lot of people like this just working and coming together for this movie. And I think that's part of it too, like that it's not like there's like 3 strong actors in this and they hold the movie up. It's like everybody is firing on all cylinders for this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think there's like a weak performance among any of it. And again, kind of huge testament to like Leo and Tom Hanks, because I think they carry the bulk of the movie. And like I said, it's about 2 hours and 20 minutes, and sort of they are the majority of it. And 2 phenomenal actors, 2 legendary actors actually, that would probably go down in whatever acting hall of fame that they have.
Casting Martin Sheen as the father-in-law, who was like in 3 scenes. He didn't have to do this. He could have hired some guy for that role, right? It's not that important. It's not that big, but he got Martin Sheen, who in 2002 was already like a venerable like Hollywood institution.
Yeah. Any other business?
No, I think this is just a really solid one. And I think it's interesting how many corners it can kind of cut. Like one thing we didn't really get into is how a lot of what Frank does is kind of unearned. Like there's not much in there in terms of like a character arc or like challenges to overcome. Like by the very nature of the story, pretty much everything comes easy to Frank and he doesn't really have any big challenges, right? He's just really good at this and it just keeps working until it doesn't. And I think that kind of is an unusual character arc. Like it's not textbook, right? But I think it's interesting to see how it works in spite of that, because the other pieces are so strong and because it just fits this kind of story. Like that's kind of how scammers work. Everything works out for them until one day it doesn't, and then it all falls apart. And that's exactly what happens to him. And then he has to compromise, and he kind of has to admit that the party is over, and he kind of, from that point on, he kind of muddles through. And that's kind of how the movie ends. I think it works in this particular case.
And I think it's like the element of, because obviously kind of what you're describing there is like, being lucky until your luck runs out, essentially. And it's kind of interesting to see how close it comes in certain instances to his luck running out. And it's like eventually things will kind of catch up to you, and you're like, as much as you try, you can't always be perfect, and there'll like always be like certain things or something that you do that will eventually lead to you getting caught. So it's almost like a bit of like a, not a cautionary tale, but it's kind of like a bit of a warning of like, you might think you're invincible and you might feel like you're on top of the world, but eventually things will always kind of come crashing down and reality will come back to bite.
Which ties into this idea of growing up, right? Frank doesn't have to grow up until he gets caught by Carl. And from that on, it's a different game.
My last thought to it I would say, I think I've pretty much said everything. It's, I enjoy the film. I definitely do see I understand why it's got longevity to it. It's got replay value. What I can say is I enjoyed it. I had a good time. So I would give this one a solid 7 out of 10, maybe even a 7.5. I'll give it a solid 7 out of 10.
Cool. And I guess just to tie things up neatly in a bow, for me, again, we kind of touched on it, is that there's maybe like things of it that you kind of, when I was younger, you were like, I was looking at it with rose tinted glasses, where some of the cons were a lot more glamorous and a lot more shinier than what it was, kind of looking at it with recent eyes. And some of the cat and mouse aspect of it was probably a little bit more glossier and shinier, kind of like back in the days, than what it is now. But even with that, it doesn't kind of detract how much I enjoy the movie and how much I enjoy kind of being on that ride with Frank through his many highs and obviously his eventual low when he gets caught. I will say, like, all of the kind of the character and like the heart that they put into the movie still stand up really well. Like, even though I've seen it so many times, even though I've like experienced it, it still hits every single time. And it's like that scene when he's outside of his mum's place and he kind of sees that his father's died and his mother's kind of moved on with a whole new family, and he kind of come to the realization that his dreams to bring them together is over. It's like, it's touching, and it kind of, I don't know, for me anyways, it gets me every single time that comes on. So definitely does a good job of holding up. It's one that I will always kind of recommend to people and be like, if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a watch. It's a fun movie, and like we've said before, it's not challenging. It's like nothing sort of controversial in there. It's just like an easy, fun ride to be on.
And I think that is why it holds up, and that is why it works on rewatch, is because even if the scams themselves are for the most part not that impressive or make that much sense, it's this humanity, it's the heart of it. Even if you don't care, like myself, you don't really care about the family angle, there's still kind of the psychology of Frank and kind of the compassion that Carl kind of has for him. He wants to be caught, but he kind of develops kind of a feeling for why Frank is doing what he's doing. On some level, he becomes concerned for him. It's those little touches that I think imbue this with a humanity that if it didn't have that, then it would not have aged as well, and it would not be as watchable once you've seen it.
Okay, guys, thank you very much for tuning into today's discussion.
If you reach this part of the episode, as always, we appreciate your support. We appreciate you pressing play and just giving us a listen. And as always, if you liked what you heard today and you enjoyed our discussion, you should probably tell a friend. And if you hated everything and you thought we were chatting a bunch of nonsense, you better run before we catch you. We are the Out of the Storm podcast.
All right, guys, thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Au revoir.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.